Sometimes a story doesn't start with fireworks, not with an explosion or a dramatic televised signing ceremony. Sometimes it begins in the darkness before dawn, with a simple text message blinking onto 6,000 phones. A message that simply says, "Go home. Await further instructions." And before anyone can rub the sleep from their eyes, a century-old machine grinds to a halt. Picture it. Chicago's enormous stamping presses sitting silent, the cavernous lines in Michigan still as tombs, and a chill spreading across an entire industry that thought it had seen every crisis imaginable. If you're just joining us, take a deep breath, because what unfolded over a few short days has already been called the most abrupt rupture in America's auto history. But don't rush to any conclusions yet. You're about to hear details that will make you question who is truly winning and who is just surviving. So stay with us until the end, and if you care about uncovering these hidden shifts, be sure to subscribe and like, because the twists you'll hear in this story might vanish from the headlines, but their impact could last a generation. Let's pull back the curtain slowly. May 17th, 2025, a date that will be studied in boardrooms and textbooks for decades. That was when President Trump signed a proclamation imposing a flat 25% tariff on every single imported car and component crossing into the United States. Not just the finished vehicles gleaming on the deck of a carrier ship, but the nuts, bolts, wires, chips, everything that helps modern assembly lines function. At first, Ford executives tried to project calm. After all, this was a company that survived the Great Depression, oil embargoes, and the 2008 meltdown. But within 48 hours, the calculations began to sour. Steel invoices ballooned overnight. Wiring harness suppliers doubled quotes. Freight companies ripped up their logistics schedules in real time. It was as if someone had poured sugar into the gears of 1,000 finely tuned machines. Then came the announcement Ford's own crisis memo could barely soften $1. $5 billion in lost profits for this year alone. In a single stroke, Detroit's crown jewel had to shred its entire earnings forecast, a move that longtime analysts confessed they had never seen in the middle of a model year launch. But the trouble didn't stop at the gates of Ford's Michigan plants. Far from it. In Mexico, where Ford builds the Mustang Mach-E and the Bronco Sport, executives slapped an emergency price hike up to $2,000 per vehicle. In Canada, stamping plants prepared to dim the lights on night shifts. Across the American Midwest, dealers started printing provisional surcharge notices and taping them to windshields while customers were at lunch. Imagine walking into a dealership on a Saturday morning, expecting to haggle over a rebate, and instead finding a quiet sticker shock that no one had prepared you for. That moment, multiplied across thousands of buyers, triggered something the industry calls silent churn. Customers walking away in confusion or disgust, some delaying purchases, some pivoting to the used car aisle. And here's the irony. In the White House, officials celebrated the tariffs as a triumph for American manufacturing. Yet, in the factories, legal teams drafted layoff scenarios faster than public relations could keep up. If you think this was the end of the tremors, you're mistaken, because by the first week of June, Stellantis quietly followed Ford's retreat. 900 workers were furloughed across 5 powertrain plants, 3 of them in Indiana. A Jeep SUV line in Windsor, Canada, went dark, and a second in Toluca, Mexico, froze output mid-shift. What does that mean? Every Jeep transmission stuck on that assembly line triggered a ripple effect. Seat suppliers, glass companies, wiring harness makers, hundreds of smaller firms stared at a black hole of lost orders. Analysts began whispering that the auto supply chain, once a seamless North American network, was fracturing along every border crossing. And as steel brokers hiked quotes to 15-month highs, trucking firms in El Paso reported 40-hour backlogs. Catalytic converters and brake pads sat under plastic tarps for days while customs officials verified origin codes. By mid-June, the United Auto Workers Research Division estimated that if the tariffs lasted through summer, factories could lose 20,000 vehicles of output per day, almost a third of normal capacity. Picture a chessboard with every piece paralyzed. Then imagine that paralysis compounding week after week. Yet, President Trump doubled down at a rally in Dayton, proclaiming the tariffs as evidence that America was finally standing up for itself. But in that same audience, some supporters were quietly pulling out their phone calculators, realizing that their 48-month payment plans had just ballooned by hundreds of dollars. Don't look away yet, because this story gets stranger. As U.S. buyers began to flinch at the price tags, China retaliated. On April 4th, Beijing slapped a 34% tariff on all U.S.-made vehicles and drivetrains. Within 6 weeks, the China Passenger Car Association released a staggering statistic. U.S. auto imports into China fell 48%, the steepest plunge ever recorded. Showrooms from Shanghai to Shenzhen yanked Ford Explorers off the floors and replaced them with Hyundai Tucsons and Peugeot crossovers. And here's where the dominoes fall in unexpected ways. Every car Detroit couldn't sell in China ricocheted back into U.S. inventories, where the tariffs had already inflated costs by thousands per unit. Anderson Economic Group published an estimate that the combined effect would tack on $2,000 to $12,000 in extra costs per vehicle, depending on where it was built. Meanwhile, social media influencers in China filmed side-by-side price checks. Videos went viral showing Korean SUVs undercutting equivalent U.S. imports by enough to buy an iPhone Pro. Imagine that. A single TikTok clip reframing American brands as overpriced relics. If you're finding this almost too chaotic to track, you're not alone. Some Wall Street economists now warn the tariff spiral is becoming a self-feeding loop. Fewer exports mean less scale means higher unit costs. Higher costs demand even steeper prices, and those prices kill yet more demand. Yet the administration insisted this was all necessary pain to force factories back onto American soil. But behind closed doors, some executives at Ford and Stellantis discussed an unthinkable option: moving more production to South Korea and Mexico to survive. The policy designed to bring jobs home was quietly pushing them away. Pause here for a moment, because this is where you see the first outlines of a question no one in Washington wanted to answer. What happens when the cure becomes worse than the disease? If you find this investigation valuable, subscribe right now and like this video, because there are even more layers of fallout that most headlines won't show you. Let's look at the port of Long Beach, California. In May, officials logged 60 canceled sailings, 150,000 containers that never arrived. The port's chief executive admitted that the cancellations were starting to exceed what he saw during the pandemic lockdowns. Every missing container starved stamping plants of sheet metal, chips, and sensors. Lead times stretched 6 weeks and counting. Hyundai sent out warnings to U.S. dealers. Prepare for up to $3,000 extra per vehicle to recoup tariff losses. Cox Automotive analysts estimated anything built across the border could see double that surcharge by fall. Governors from Ohio to Alabama were now pleading with Washington to relax the policy, because what once seemed unthinkable, a full-scale relocation of manufacturing, was now a live scenario on every corporate contingency plan. And yet, amid all this turmoil, the political engine kept revving. Every rally clip showed the same refrain: America first. But inside the factories, finance teams wrestled with supply contracts and emergency credit lines. Small parts makers maxed out loans to stockpile inventory, terrified that the next border delay would bankrupt them before Christmas. While the tariffs had been marketed as protection, dealers on Main Street called it something else: sticker paralysis. Rebates vanished, customers paused, and a once booming market turned into an anxious waiting game. Some say the next twist could be a massive wave of unsold vehicles, piling up in Mexican rail yards and rusting under the sun. Others believe the pressure will crack Washington's resolve before that happens, but no one is betting their livelihood on a quick resolution. In these uncertain days, the only certainty is that every decision has consequences that ripple far beyond a single press conference. If the tariff stays through next quarter, the costs will keep compounding, and the question of who gets protected will become more uncomfortable to answer. If you want to keep following this evolving story, don't forget to subscribe and click like. Your support helps us keep pulling back the curtain on stories that shape the world you live in. As the summer months rolled forward, what had begun as a targeted tariff shock started to resemble a slow-moving economic undertow, dragging entire regions into uncertainty. You could see it in the parking lots behind dealerships, rows of gleaming trucks and crossovers lined up under baking sun, their prices creeping higher every week. You could hear it in the voices of sales managers who once spoke in confident bursts, but now answered questions with uneasy pauses, and you could feel it in the way ordinary buyers clutched their financing papers, calculating not just what they could afford today, but whether tomorrow's cost would explode beyond their reach. Because by July, something strange had begun to happen. The standard incentives that for decades smoothed over price bumps, cashback bonuses, low-interest loans, loyalty discounts, were vanishing like melting frost. Instead, every new shipment from a port or rail hub arrived with a fresh surcharge stapled to the invoice, and no one could say if that surcharge was the last or simply the next in a long chain. Some industry veterans described it as a creeping paralysis. Others compared it to a fever dream in which you watch familiar landmarks warp into unrecognizable shapes. The uncomfortable question settled over Detroit like a summer haze. What if this was not a temporary setback? What if the entire ecosystem, supplier networks, pricing models, buyer psychology, was shifting into something no one could easily unwind? In boardrooms and supplier workshops, meetings stretched long into the night. Many companies started pulling out dusty contingency binders marked with names most employees had forgotten: Operation Redirection, Project Phoenix, Strategic Pivot. These were plans first scribbled down during past trade scuffles, but shelved when the storm clouds blew over. Now they were back in play. Some plans contemplated moving production permanently to Mexico or even further abroad. Others sketched out drastic layoffs that would shutter plants and leave thousands of families in limbo. And still others floated the idea of splitting operations in two: a higher-cost American line to satisfy political pressure and a cheaper offshore stream to keep shareholders from revolting. But no matter how they sliced the scenarios, each path led to a difficult trade-off. Who would be sacrificed first? Which communities would lose their tax base? Which suppliers would see orders dry up and phone lines go silent? By mid-July, the domino effect was visible on the ground. A Michigan die-casting plant that made essential transmission parts abruptly canceled a third shift and furloughed over 200 workers. The company's statement cited unanticipated cost volatility. A Tennessee logistics firm that specialized in cross-border auto components announced it would close one warehouse and reduce headcount by 15%. Truck drivers crossing the border at Laredo reported queues so long that pallets of brake systems sat in 100-degree heat for days, exposed to the elements, while clerks double-checked every manifest. Some truckers began refusing certain routes altogether, fearing that they'd be stuck for a week without pay. Even large corporate transporters started adding hefty tariff risk premiums to their bids, an expense that landed squarely in the price of every minivan and electric SUV. Imagine watching that surcharge tick upward, knowing that every tick meant fewer people would buy, more workers would be laid off, and fewer communities would have a stake in keeping the assembly lines alive. And while the headlines focused on Ford and Stellantis, other players were quietly bracing for impact. Toyota convened emergency calls with governors in Kentucky and Indiana, describing scenarios that would cut regional output by 20% if the tariff climate persisted through the fall. The Honda hinted that some of its U.S. production could be reevaluated if raw material costs didn't stabilize. Even Tesla, which had once been thought insulated because of its domestic battery production, began to warn investors that specialized components, rare earth magnets, sophisticated wiring harnesses, were still subject to border friction and could trigger unpredictable expenses. It was as though an invisible fog had settled over the entire sector, blurring every forecast and infecting every balance sheet. But perhaps the most unsettling development wasn't inside the factories or on the balance sheets. It was in the minds of buyers, because once you teach people to expect sudden price spikes, you also teach them to hesitate. And once hesitation becomes habit, it can be harder to cure than any supply chain glitch. Some dealers noticed shoppers walking the lot in silence, avoiding eye contact with salespeople. Others said customers pulled up configurator apps on their phones, comparing models but never committing, as if bracing for another price hike tomorrow. Industry insiders began calling it the tariff freeze, not because the market stopped instantly, but because it slowed to a crawl so gradual that no one could pinpoint the day it began. You might ask yourself, can an economy function when buyers no longer trust the sticker price? And while this deep freeze took hold domestically, an equally potent shock played out across the Pacific. Chinese distributors who once championed American SUVs began ripping out showroom displays, replacing them with Korean and European badges. It happened fast, almost too fast to comprehend. One week, a dealership in Shenzhen boasted a wall of Ford Explorers. The next, it was filled with rows of Peugeot crossovers and posters advertising tariff-free peace of mind. In Shanghai, sales teams ran promotions that explicitly compared American and Korean models side by side, highlighting price gaps big enough to buy a year's worth of fuel. And on Chinese social media, influencers made viral videos poking fun at the idea of paying premium prices for vehicles that could be stuck in customs limbo or taxed again at any moment. Some industry veterans privately admitted that once a brand becomes associated with volatility, regaining trust can take a generation. All the while, the White House continued to defend the policy, arguing that short-term pain was the price of reclaiming industrial self-sufficiency. But how much pain and for how long? No one could answer with certainty. Was it a matter of months before a truce emerged, or were we witnessing a structural reordering of the auto landscape? And if it was the latter, who would still be standing when the dust finally settled? If you've made it this far, consider subscribing and liking this video, because the next phase of this crisis could rewrite the rules of global trade in ways no one has fully grasped. You have to wonder, how many more cancellations, how many more surprise surcharges, how many more late-night memos will it take before someone blinks? Will Washington ease off the throttle before the damage becomes irreversible? Or will the tariff engine keep roaring until the showroom lights go out one by one across the heartland? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And stay tuned, because the final chapters of this saga have yet to be written.